All right, so let's dive into something pretty major that just happened. At Commio, we've heard that Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, they don't care that this just happened. They will reject new campaigns that are not one-to-one consent compliant. It's business as usual for every provider like us at Commio. So it's important that anyone in the lead generation space or any other use case that is not one-to-one compliant, you're going to have a bad time. And you should work under the assumption that you must be compliant.
Welcome to the CommioCast. I'm Tim McLean, Commio's Director of Marketing. Thanks for tuning in. Here we talk about all things cloud communications. Think modern calling and text messaging and more, all in the cloud. In this episode, as always, our hosts Micah and Kali join us from their virtual recording studio at Notebook LM. Guys, take it away.
Yeah, what's really fascinating here is that we're talking about the 11th Circuit Court striking down the FCC's one-to-one consent rule for marketing calls and texts. You'd think this would be a huge win for marketers, but it's almost like it didn't even happen.
Okay, so that's what we're unpacking today, this 11th Circuit Court decision, and why it matters so much to you, especially if you're in a business that relies on outreach.
Right, so first things first. One-to-one consent, in plain English, means you need explicit permission from each individual person before you can send them marketing calls or texts. No bundling consent, no assuming they're okay with it because they signed up for something vaguely related. Each person, each time, clear as day.
And the FCC was really pushing to make this the law of the land. They even set a deadline for January 2025, which, well, is basically now. But then the court stepped in.
Yeah, the Insurance Marketing Coalition challenged this FCC rule, and the 11th Circuit Court actually sided with them. They basically said the FCC's interpretation of consent was too broad, and they didn't have the authority to enforce it in the way they were trying to.
So it's back to the drawing board for the FCC. But what's really throwing everyone for a loop is that these big carriers are like, we're sticking with one-to-one consent regardless. That has huge implications, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Let's break down what the FCC rule actually said before it got struck down. They were trying to implement this one seller at a time requirement, which was pretty restrictive.
Can you give us an example of what that would look like in the real world?
Imagine you're running a lead generation campaign and someone fills out a form on your website showing interest in, say, a mortgage. Under the FCC's rule, you wouldn't have been able to connect them with multiple lenders. You would have needed separate consent from that person for each lender before you could even share their information.
Wow, that would have been a logistical nightmare for businesses.
Exactly. And then there was this other requirement that was really confusing, the logically and topically associated rule.
What was that all about?
It essentially meant that the FCC was trying to limit marketing messages to the exact things someone gave consent for. So if you signed up for appointment reminders from your doctor, they wouldn't have been able to text you about a flu shot clinic, even though it's still related to healthcare. It was very narrow.
Okay, I'm starting to see why the court pushed back on this. It sounds like the FCC was really trying to micromanage things.
Yeah, the court basically said the FCC was adding all these extra restrictions that weren't actually in the Telephone Consumer Protection Act or the TCPA, which is the main law that governs these types of calls and texts.
So the FCC loses the rule, gets vacated, and you'd think everyone would just go back to the old way of doing things. But then these major carriers throw a curveball and say, nope, we're sticking with one-to-one consent. That's got to be frustrating for businesses that were hoping for a more relaxed approach.
It definitely throws a wrench in the works. But the bigger question is, why are the carriers doing this? They don't legally have to anymore.
Right, that's what I'm wondering. What's in it for them?
Well, one possibility is they're trying to get ahead of the curve. The FCC could always try to rewrite the rule or appeal the decision, so maybe the carriers are just preemptively aligning themselves with what they think will eventually become the standard anyway.
I guess that makes sense. They don't want to have to scramble and change their practices later on. But couldn't it also be about public perception?
Absolutely.
Right.
By taking a strong stance on consumer privacy, even when they don't legally have to, these carriers can position themselves as the good guys and potentially attract more customers who value those protections.
Okay, so it could be a mix of legal strategy, brand image, and maybe even a genuine desire to protect their customers from unwanted calls. Whatever the reason, the bottom line is one-to-one consent is the new reality, whether businesses like it or not. And that's what we're going to unpack in this deep dive. What does this mean for you, and what do you need to do to make sure your business stays compliant and avoids any disruptions?
That's a really great point. It's not just about understanding the legal back and forth. It's about taking action to protect your business. Let's start with the most critical question. What do you need to do right now to adapt? The first thing you need to do is audit your current consent practices. Are you relying on those broad consent forms that might not hold up under this stricter standard? You know, the ones where it's buried in the fine print and it says, by submitting this form, you agree to receive marketing communications from us and our partners.
Yeah, I think a lot of businesses probably have those kinds of forms. I know I've definitely seen them before.
It's incredibly common. But the key now is clarity and being explicit. You need to ask for permission to contact individuals for specific marketing purposes.
So what would that look like in practice?
You need to spell things out. Who will be contacting them? What will they be contacted about? And how will they be contacted? No more vague language. And remember, you need separate consent for each company or purpose. For example, if you're in lead generation and you're planning to connect someone with 3 different insurance providers, you need 3 separate consents, one for each provider.
Okay, so you've audited your consent practices and made sure everything is crystal clear. What about your existing leads? Can you still contact them if you got their consent under the old, less strict rules?
That's where things get a little murky. Legally, the court's decision doesn't automatically invalidate consent that was previously obtained. But remember, we're talking about a practical reality here. The carriers are the ones calling the shots now, and they've made it clear they're moving toward this higher standard.
So playing it safe is probably the best strategy here.
Absolutely. I wouldn't rely on those old consents, especially if you're working with those carriers like Verizon and AT&T that have publicly stated they're enforcing one-to-one consent.
So what would you recommend businesses do with their existing leads? Just start from scratch?
Not necessarily. You can re-engage them. Explain that the rules of the game have changed and offer them a chance to opt in again under the stricter standard.
So transparency is key here.
Exactly. And think of it this way. It's an opportunity. Re-engaging your leads allows you to refresh their interest, remind them why they were interested in the first place, and even segment them more effectively based on their current preferences. It's a chance to build a more targeted, engaged audience.
Okay, so we talked about consent forms and existing leads. Now let's talk about lead generation itself. How does one-to-one consent impact how businesses go about finding new leads?
This is where things get really interesting. Those traditional methods like buying lists or scraping data, those are going to become even riskier than they already were.
Because you can't be sure you have that explicit one-to-one consent from those individuals.
Right. You're essentially operating on assumptions. And as we've been discussing, assumptions can get you in trouble in this new environment.
So what's the alternative? How can businesses generate leads effectively in a world where one-to-one consent is the gold standard?
It's all about shifting your mindset. Instead of trying to cast a wide net and hoping to catch a few leads, you need to be more focused and deliberate. Think quality over quantity.
So things like content marketing, building relationships with potential customers on social media, those strategies become even more important.
Absolutely. It's about attracting the right kind of leads, people who are genuinely interested in what you have to offer and therefore much more likely to give their consent willingly. You're not trying to trick anyone into opting in. You're providing value and building trust.
And that takes time, right? It's not a quick fix.
Exactly. It's a slower, more deliberate process. But what you end up with are stronger, more sustainable relationships. You're not just collecting contacts, you're building an audience of people who are genuinely interested in what you have to say.
And probably a higher conversion rate in the long run because you're connecting with people who actually want to hear from you.
Precisely. It's not just about compliance, it's about a better approach to marketing overall.
All right, so we've talked about what businesses can do to adapt to this new reality. But the legal situation is still a bit up in the air, isn't it? What happens next with the FCC?
That's the big question. The 11th Circuit basically sent the rule back to the FCC and said, figure this out. So they have a few options. They could try to rewrite the rule, maybe narrow it down and address the court's concerns. They could appeal the decision to a higher court and hope for a different outcome. Or they could just do nothing and let the court's decision stand.
And each of those options has different implications for businesses, right?
Exactly. If the FCC rewrites the rule, we might end up with a whole new set of requirements to navigate. If they appeal, we could be in this uncertain state for years while the legal battle plays out. And if they do nothing, then we're essentially in the situation we're in now, where the carriers are calling the shots and setting the de facto standard.
So a lot of uncertainty, which makes it even more important for businesses to stay informed and be flexible.
Absolutely. This is a dynamic situation. The rules of the game are evolving, and you need to be able to adapt quickly.
Well, that's where the deep dive comes in. We'll continue to keep you updated on any new developments and provide you with the insights you need to stay ahead of the curve. But before we wrap up, I think it's important to take a step back and look at the bigger picture here. Could this whole one-to-one consent situation have implications beyond just marketing calls and texts?
It's definitely something to consider. What we're seeing is a major industry shift happening, not because of government regulation, but because the carriers themselves are stepping up and saying, this is how we're going to do things.
Right? They're setting a new standard for consumer privacy, even though they don't legally have to.
Exactly. And that could have ripple effects. Could this lead to a broader rethinking of consent practices across other industries? Will we see similar movements in email marketing, social media data collection in general? It's a fascinating question.
Yeah, it really makes you think, like, what if this is just the beginning? You know? Could this be like a turning point for how we think about data privacy in general?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. I mean, consumers are getting more and more aware of, how their information is being used. And they're going to want more control.
Yeah.
If these carriers can really make this stricter approach to consent work, I think it could push other companies to do the same, just to stay competitive and, keep their customers happy.
So it's not just about like the legal side of things anymore. It's about, meeting what your customers expect.
Yeah.
And customers are getting pretty smart about data privacy these days.
Exactly. And, that's good for everyone in the end. A more privacy-focused, digital world is better for everyone.
It's like we're at this, crossroads. The FCC tried to make a change, but the court said no. And now the carriers are like stepping up to do it themselves. It's kind of creating this like chain reaction that could change the whole data privacy landscape.
It's really interesting to see how this all plays out. And as always, businesses need to stay informed and be ready to adapt.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially in a situation like this where the rules are like always changing.
And that's what we try to do here at the Deep Dive, We keep an eye on things and keep you updated.
So to wrap things up, let's leave our listeners with this thought. What if this goes beyond just, marketing calls and texts? What if this is the start of like a bigger push for stricter consent across the board? Not because of laws, but because customers want it and the industry's leading the way. It's something to think about as we enter this new world of data privacy. And as always, the Deep Dive will be here to guide you through it all. Thanks for tuning in.
Building amazing experiences that engage and delight your customers is easy with Commio. Our smart, reliable voice and messaging solutions are easy to implement and scale with you so you can deliver more calls and texts, be more competitive, and save money. With Commio, you get peace of mind and happier customers. Find out why thousands of software platforms and enterprises trust Commio with their communications. Get a demo today.